Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the Speckled Stripes Infinity Scarf. So this is actually a super simple scarf to knit. There's really not a whole lot involved here other than knitting in the round and just changing colors. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with a provisional cast on, which is a cast on edge that can be removed, and then we will graft the ends of the scarf together when we're finished. Now, don't let that scare you off, or don't be afraid of the grafting. It's not as hard as it sounds. And the way that I like to teach it is really not that difficult to learn. So the first thing you're going to need is the free written pattern. You can get that in the link in the description box on my blog, or you can purchase a large print ad-free printable PDF version of the pattern via the second link in the description box below. So here's what you're going to need for this project. I have 2 skeins of yarn here. These are both fingering weight, and these are Knit Picks Stroll fingering. This is from the limited edition Sock Labs series. So these are only available for a limited time, but any fingering weight yarn can be substituted for this, especially if you just get a different colorway of the stroll, because the stroll yarn line is always available from Knit Picks, but this is just the limited edition part is just for these colorways. But they have other regular colorways that you can get with this same yarn pretty much anytime you want. So these are both 100 grams or 3.5 ounce skeins with 462 yards each. This one is grape speckle, and this one is grape, even though it is also speckled. So I'm going to be striping these 2 colors together. So I have 2 contrasting colors here, and even though they are speckled, it's not going to be like too crazy busy or anything because it's just a light fleck. It's not like, 3 or 4 colors in each one. So as for yarn, you just need a fingering weight yarn with enough yardage to equal what the pattern requires. And I also have here a circular knitting needle. This is a 16-inch long circular knitting needle, also from Knit Picks. And this one is a size 2, a 2.75 millimeter needle. This one is nickel plated from Knit Picks. This is the fixed circular. And that is going to be what we're knitting on. If you don't have a circular knitting needle, then you can use double points if you'd rather, or you can use a really long circular with the magic loop method. I also have a measuring tape for measuring the gauge and for measuring the length of the scarf. Coincidentally, this is also from Knit Picks. And I have a yarn needle or blunt tapestry needle. This is a chibi with a bent tip. And I have some scissors. So now that we have all of our supplies, we can start knitting. So we are going to begin this project with a provisional cast on, which is a cast on that can be removed so that we can graft the ends together later. And like I said, the grafting is not as hard as it sounds, so don't let that deter you from making this project because it's really not that difficult to do. So here's my working yarn, and I've gone ahead and cut a length of the other color to use as a piece of waste yarn. So this one is almost a yard long, and we're going to be using this as the foundation for our provisional cast on. And this yarn will hold all of the live stitches on the cast on edge so that they will not come unraveled and so that we can pick them up later to work our graft. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the 2 ends. I've got the end of my waste yarn and the end of my working yarn, and I'm going to tie them just in an overhand knot. Just a regular knot. But we're not going to pull it super tight. We're not going to like yank on it and pull it really, really tight. We just want it to be tied together. So now that we have our knot, we're going to hold this in the slingshot position, which means I'm going to take the yarn in my hand so that it is coming over top of my index finger. And then I'm going to lift up my thumb so that the yarn is also coming over the top of my thumb towards me. And both ends of the yarn are over here. The rest of the yarn is coming down from my hand and held in my other fingers. And then I'm going to pick up the needle like this, and I'm going to hold the knot up against the top of my needle with my index finger. So I'm going to secure that knot with my index finger. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of bring the right needle under the waste yarn so that it's in the middle, over the back of the working yarn, and then grab that working yarn and bring it forward underneath the waste yarn, like so. And then we're going to yarn over with the working yarn. So that's 2 stitches right there. Here's the first stitch, and the yarn over is the second stitch. So now again, I'm going to bring my needle forward in front of the waste yarn, around it, or basically around it towards me, like this. Then I'm going to bring it back around the working yarn, grab that working yarn and lift it up in front of the waste yarn. So that's my 3rd stitch. And then I'm going to yarn over. That is my 4th stitch. So again, I'm going to bring the right needle around the waste yarn towards me so that it is in the middle between those 2 strands. Then I'm going to bring it back behind the working yarn away from me, grab that working yarn and lift it up in front of the waste yarn, and then yarn over. So I'm going to continue doing this until I have a total of 98 stitches on my needle. Now, as you can see right here, the knot just sits below the needle. When we go to actually use the cast on edge for the graft, we're going to remove the knot. So don't worry about the knot, but that's just to hold it for now. And right now I have 6 stitches on my needle. I'm going to keep going till I have 98. So again, I'm bringing my right needle towards me under the waste yarn, and then behind the working yarn, bring that strand of working yarn up in front of the waste yarn, and then yarn over. So again, I'm going to keep doing this until I have a total of 98 stitches. Alright, so that's my 98th stitch. And at this point, you can see that the last one was a yarn over. So we just need to be careful that we don't accidentally undo the yarn over. So I'm just going to hold on to that. And one thing that you want to do before you get started is kind of give it a stretch, slide all the rest of the needles up onto the other needle at the other end, because you don't want the waste yarn to be cinching those stitches too much. So now that we have that cast on all the way around, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to twist the waste yarn around that working yarn just to secure that so that the yarn over doesn't come undone. That's not exactly necessary, but recommended, because you don't want that yarn over to just pop off the needle on its own. So now we're going to lay this out so that the needle with the yarn coming out of it is in the right hand, and the needle with the tails is in the left hand. We want to lay this out in front of us so that we can see the waste yarn, because we want to make sure that our cast on is not twisted. Of course, it could still get twisted on the first round, so we're going to check it again after that. But we want to make sure we see that waste yarn running consistently around the inside edge of our circular needle. So one more thing that you're going to need, I think I forgot to mention this in the beginning of the video, you're going to need a stitch marker. This one is an O or ring style stitch marker. And we're going to slip this onto the right hand needle, and this is going to mark the beginning and end of every round. So we will know that each time we have finished a round, we will come to that marker. So now we can pick this up and start knitting. And what we're going to do is we're going to put like I said, the needle with the tails on it in the left hand, the needle with the yarn coming off of it in the right hand. And what we want to do is we're going to go ahead and pick up the yarn. Now for me, I normally pick up the yarn like this, but I've found that with thinner yarns like this one, and especially if I'm using a nickel-plated needle, that can make my tension too loose. So I am going to go ahead and wrap around my pinky, which I don't normally do, but in this case it works for me. Of course, you need to tension it however works best for you. So now we're going to start knitting, and for rounds 1 to 15, we're just going to knit all the way around, over and over and over again. So I'm going to hang on to my little tails there to grab that first stitch because we don't want it to get loose on the first stitch. We're going to pull it tight. And on this first round, this is probably going to be the hardest round to knit into just because it is the cast on edge and that can be a little more difficult. So we want to kind of scoot all of the stitches up on the left needle. And we're just going to pull that first stitch tight after we've knit it and knit every stitch all the way around until we get back to the marker. Alright, so I've knit all the way around. Now I'm just going to slip the marker to the right hand needle. And we're going to knit all the way around for another 14 rounds. So it's rounds 1 to 15. We just knit all the way around. And you want to check before you start your next round, your second round, to make sure that your waste yarn edge, your cast on edge, is still not twisted. So it should still be running around the inside edge of the circular needle. And as long as it is, then you can just keep knitting. So I'm going to continue for another 14 rounds until I have a total of 15 rounds. Alright, so I have finished round 15 and I have slipped my marker. And this is how long my piece is at this point. And you do want to keep in mind that when you're counting your rows, if you push 2 of the loops that are sitting on the waste yarn together, it kind of looks like a V shape. That's because that is actually your first row. So the waste yarn is just holding the loops in your first row, but there is no like cast on row because all this is just knitted fabric, no cast on except for the waste yarn that's holding it. So the loops on the waste yarn count as your first row. So I have that as my first row and then 14 more after that. So now we're going to change to the white, which is actually called grape speckle, but it's on mostly white. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cut my purple yarn, leaving a 4 to 5 inch tail or longer, depending on your preference. And what we're going to do is we are going to pick up the white yarn and we are going to knit 1 round as normal. And I like to do this by kind of holding both tails together in my right hand with the right needle. And we're going to just knit all the way around until we get back to the marker with the white yarn. Alright, so I'm back around to the beginning. Of course, that last purple stitch is very loose because it's not secured. Then slip my marker. So if we just kind of pull on that purple tail, we'll see that stitch go back to where it is supposed to be as far as the size. Now what we need to do is we need to fix the jog in our stripe. So since we're moving on to another color stripe, we have to keep in mind that when we are knitting in the round, we're not just stacking round after round after round, we are going in a spiral. And so when you're working in a spiral, the end of our first white row is actually going to be above. It's going to sit above. If I take the marker off, then you can see it better. The end of our first white row will sit above the beginning of that same row. So to correct this, first of all, I need to put my marker back on, but we are going to slip the first stitch of the round as if to purl. So we're inserting the needle from back to front into the right leg of the stitch and not working into it. We're not knitting it, we're not purling it, we're just slipping that stitch. And then we can knit around as normal. So I'm going to go ahead and pull on my tails a little bit just to make it even out. And we're going to knit around as normal. And what this will do, eventually, of course, we're going to also weave in our tails, and that will also help a little bit. And the method you use to weave them in can make a difference as well. But that very first stitch, since we slipped it, That's kind of elongated a little bit, but not as much as 2 whole rows. So that will kind of smooth out the gap or the jog in between our last stitch of this row that was purple and the first stitch of the first white round that was white. So now we can just knit all the way around until we get back to the marker. All right, so I'm back around and I'll slip my marker. And of course our first and last stitches between the color change are still going to be loose because we haven't done anything with these tails yet. But we will take care of that after a few more rounds. When you do that is kind of up to you, but I am choosing to weave in the tails as I go. So after I do the rest of the white stripe, then I'll go ahead and weave in those tails. But what we just did is that first white round, the plain one where we just knit every stitch, was round 16. Round 17 was where we slipped the first stitch and then knit all the way around. And now for rows 18 to 45, we're just going to knit all the way around with the white. And we can see that very first stitch that was slipped, that's still loose because we have a tail coming out of that stitch. If we didn't, that would be one thing, and it would not loosen up every time we work into it. But because we are making such wide stripes here, it's not going to make a lot of sense to carry the yarn up through every stripe. So now I'm just going to knit all the way around for rows 18 to 45, slipping the marker every time I come to it. And once we've finished with this white stripe, we will have a total of 30 white rounds. And even with the stitch marker kind of in the way, you can see that once we weave in those tails, that join where we changed colors will be next to invisible, if not totally invisible, because that little jogless stripe trick just totally smooths it out. And it will also be further smoothed out by the way I'm going to show you how we're weaving in the tails here. So I'm going to continue working rounds 18 to 45 till I finished my white stripe. Alright, so I finished my round 45. I did stop one stitch before the marker, not because I'm not going to knit it, because I am, but just so that the marker won't fall off while I show you how we weave in these tails down here, because you can see right here there's still a hole. And if I had tied these two tails from the inside where we change colors, if I had tied them together in a knot, it would have worked okay, but it can look better if we weave them in. And I'm going to show you exactly how we're going to do that to make it look as seamless and invisible as possible. But this is the end of my white stripe here. So I'm going to turn this kind of inside out and over, and we're going to look at what we have going on back here. So right here, this is where our purple round ends and our white round begins. So what we need to do to make this kind of even more invisible than it already is, as far as the jog and the stripes, is we're going to take, if we remember, this is the end of the purple round and we came at it this direction. Of course, on the right side, we came at it from, from this way. But we can see how that this is where we were working the direction of the purple yarn, which on the back is going this way. So we're going to not weave in the purple yarn going down or to the left. We're going to weave it in going the same direction that it would have been going if we kept knitting it. So I'm going to, even though this purple round is sits a little bit below, because this is the beginning of the round and over here is the end, we're going to weave it in as though it were one round. So I'm going to take this purple tail and weave it directly into the beginning of that purple row. And then we're going to take the white tail and go this direction with it, because we want to, even though this is the beginning of the white round and the end of that same round is further up, we're going to weave it into that white round anyway. And doing that in both directions is going to help even out our stitches on the front. So if I just kind of pull these a little bit, to tighten up those loose stitches, hold them in the direction that we're going to weave them in, and turn this over, you can see that the stripe join is pretty much gone as we do that. So I'm going to take the purple yarn tail and thread it into my yarn needle, and I'm using a very thin yarn needle for this. You don't want to use a really thick one. So this is where the end of our purple round was, and I'm going to continue weaving it into the beginning of the purple round, going the same direction we would be going if we were continuing to knit it. So I am going to do something kind of similar to if we were grafting, and I'm just following that row and kind of going along with where that strand is. It kind of bubbles down before it comes into the back of the next stitch, which then comes up here under a white strand, and then comes over the top, back down under another white strand, and then it comes right back through where we just came up. So it's kind of like a wavy zigzag type of thing. And I'm just following that purple strand from the beginning of that last purple round and weaving it in on the back of the work for several inches. And before we get too far into this, we want to turn it over and look at it and make sure that none of those stitches are too loose. As far as the very last stitch, the very last purple stitch, we don't want that to be too loose. So I can see now that it's been pulled shorter so that it doesn't really look like a whole stitch, which is fine because that helps even out the jog in the stripe. And it looks very neat and tidy. So I'm going to keep weaving in this tail until I use up most of it, and then we'll weave in the white tail. Alright, so I've woven that in for about 1.5 inches, and I'm going to leave that little about 1 inch long tail that's left, because when we're finished with this, the tails are just going to sit inside the tube, and they're not going to be able to pop out, and there's going to be less chance of the end wiggling its way to the front if it's not cut short. So now that our purple tail is woven in, now I'm going to do the same with the white one, and of course the white tail is getting woven in the opposite direction, so I want to look at the front and make sure that that stitch is pulled so that it is even with the rest of the stitches, and then I can turn it over and weave in that tail going the opposite direction from where I just did the purple one. So essentially what we've done is the join was right here, the purple yarn was coming this way, and then the white yarn, we picked that up and kept going. So we're weaving the purple yarn in this way and the white yarn in this way, which closes up the little gap in the middle. And you can see right here, this strand in the back, that float of yarn, that is where we slipped the first stitch of the second white row. So if it looks like there's something missing there, it's not. That's just your slip stitch. And I also recommend that when you do this, you make your last stitch, or the last place that you wove in, you want to make it go in the direction of the matching stripe. So I'm going to pull my last stitch through going towards the white, whereas I pulled the last purple stitch through going towards the purple. So now our tails are woven in. On the front of the work, you see nothing. There is no trace of any kind of color join right there. And the fabric still lays very neat and smooth. And so now what we're going to do is, of course, I left this last stitch of the 30th round for my white stripe, which is actually round 45. That's just to hold the stitch marker on, but we would knit it anyway, and slip the marker. So that was the end of my white stripe. Now I'm going to change to purple and repeat rounds 16 to 45. So I'm going to change to purple. I'm going to knit one round normal. I'm going to slip the first stitch and then knit around for the second round. And then I'm going to just knit straight until I get to round 45, which will be a total of 30 rows for the purple. So that's basically the rest of this pattern. We're going to change colors, knit rounds 16 to 45, change colors again, knit rounds 16 to 45. So each stripe is worked with round 16 to 45. And of course, we're going to weave in the ends as we go, or I suppose you could wait till you're done. But and the reason we're weaving in these ends and changing, cutting the yarn after every stripe is because we don't want to carry the yarn all the way up a over 3-inch long stripe when we're not constantly changing in between. If we were doing 2 or 3 row stripes, or maybe even 5 row stripes, then we could carry the yarn up. But I don't want to carry the yarn up when we're dealing with such a wide stripe. So I'm going to go ahead and continue knitting my stripes. So like I said, I'm going to immediately change to purple and then repeat round 16 to 45 and then weave in my ends. Then I'll change to white, repeat round 16 to 45, weave in my ends, and etc. until my scarf is the length that I want it to be and until I have finished with the last stripe that I work should be a white stripe, because at the end we're going to work another half of a purple stripe and graft the ends of it together in the middle of the purple stripe. So we started with half a purple stripe. We're going to end with another half of a purple stripe so we can graft them together. So keep going, working these stripes until it's the length that you want and making sure that you end with a white stripe. Alright, so I have knit through most of my scarf here and I have almost all of my stripes done. So if you remember, we started with this purple and we only did half of a stripe. We did 15 rows with the purple, and then we started in with white, purple, white, purple, white, purple, white, purple, white, purple, and now we are finishing this section with a full white stripe. And what we're going to do next, I have knit a couple stitches past the stitch marker just to hold the stitch marker on there, but I'm going to undo those before I change colors again. So we're going to graft the ends of this scarf together, and that means we're going to invisibly join this end to the current end. But what we need to do is we're going to work another almost half a stripe of the purple again, so that we are doing our grafting in the middle of a stripe as opposed to on the border between two stripes, because it will help hide it better. And grafting can be completely invisible, but if you've never done it before, then there might be just a little bit of tension issues that you can go through and fix and adjust before you finish it off. But just in case it's not totally perfectly blending with the rest of the fabric, we're going to keep that grafting round in the middle of a stripe. So I have ended with a final stripe of the white. Now I'm going to change back to the purple and repeat rows 16 to 29. So basically we're doing 16 and 17, and then we are doing the just knit all the way around row until we have a total of 14 rows in the purple for what's going to be this next partial stripe. So we have 15 rows at the beginning. We're going to end with a partial stripe of 14 rows of the purple, because that grafting, it kind of equals one round of knitting. So it will still give us a total of 30 rounds in the purple, and you won't really be able to see any difference between the purple stripe and all the rest of the stripes. So I'm going to go ahead and work my partial purple stripe, and then I will show you what we're going to do next. Alright, so I have finished that last half stripe. This one only has 14 rows instead of 30, like I said, because the 15th row is going to be the grafting row. and I'm going to graft this using my favorite grafting method, which is significantly easier to understand than the Kitchener stitch. Sometimes the Kitchener stitch can be kind of confusing because there are so many steps to it and you have to insert it in the right direction and etc. So I'm going to graft this with my favorite method, which is done off of the needles. So like I already have my beginning end held on a piece of waste yarn, I am also going to thread all the stitches that are currently on my needle onto a piece of waste yarn. So I'm going to grab my yarn needle, and I have a piece of waste yarn in the white, mainly because it's a contrasting color. But if you are using a waste yarn from another type of yarn besides the one you're using, I always suggest a smooth yarn. This one's pretty smooth, and you want something that's kind of low fuzz. Cotton crochet thread works great for this, but mainly you just don't want to, when you go to pull this out of your stitches when you're finished, you don't want it to leave a bunch of fuzz goop in your stitches that you'll have to pick out. So I have gone ahead and knit one stitch past the stitch marker just to hold the stitch marker on. I'm going to undo that because I don't need that anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the stitch marker, and then I'm going to leave all of my like the working yarn, the purple working yarn, out of the way, and I'm just going to pick up all the way around. I'm going to just insert my yarn needle with the waste yarn on it as if to purl in each stitch on the needle, and I'm just slipping them off of my needle onto the waste yarn, and the waste yarn will then hold my stitches so that I can graft them together with the provisional cast on at the other end, which is essentially the same thing. The provisional cast on is a strand of waste yarn that is just holding a bunch of live loops or a round of live stitches, and we are doing the exact same thing here. So I'm going to pick up the stitches off of my needle all the way around. So here is my last few stitches. Now they are all onto the yarn needle and the waste yarn. So I'm going to remove the yarn needle from that now. And you want to make sure that your piece of waste yarn is longer than your scarf tube is around. So then that way you'll have extra tails hanging out and you won't have to worry about them accidentally, just coming undone. So we are done with the knitting needles for now. We don't need them anymore for this project. And now we're going to go ahead and graft the ends of our scarf together. So I do have an entire video on this explaining this as to why we're doing it and showing it in a bigger yarn with a different color grafting yarn so that you can really see clearly what I am doing. But in this scarf, we're doing the exact same thing. The only problem is because the stitches are so small and because I am using the yarn that matches so that it's actually invisible, it's going to be harder for you to see it in this video. So if you're not familiar with grafting, or if you haven't seen my grafting video, then you'll want to go ahead and watch that because that is a better, more clearly visible explanation of this same technique. So I have my yarn needle, and then I'm going to take the working yarn, which is still attached to my skein, and I am going to estimate about 3 times the length as my project is around. So I want to leave a tail, so to speak, that is at least 2 to 3 times longer than my project is around. So I have wrapped the yarn loosely around 3 times, and then I'm going to leave a little bit extra and cut the yarn. So this is going to be the yarn that I use to graft the piece together. And I'm going to thread this onto my yarn needle. So like I mentioned before, we have basically 2 rounds of live stitches at each end of the project, or 1 at each end, I should say. We have 1 round of live stitches up here at the top, and another round of live stitches down at the bottom, and these are both held on a length of waste yarn. So the first thing we need to do is just kind of untwist the tube a little bit so that the ends of our rounds line up. So we don't want to graft this together twisted. And to make sure that we don't do that, we just need to make sure that our tube is not twisted. And then we can bring the ends together because we're going to be grafting starting where the waste yarn is on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this direction so that the top edge is facing me right side up and the bottom edge, where we did the provisional cast on, is facing the correct direction down here. So before we can do any grafting, if you remember, this provisional cast on is held together by a knot at the very beginning. So I'm going to need to untie this little knot to graft the work. So the tip of your yarn needle, especially if you're using a really thin one, can be helpful for picking out this little knot. So we just want to untie the knot. That is basically holding those two tails together so that while we were casting on and knitting those first few rounds, the waste yarn did not come undone. So we look at the provisional cast on edge and we have a row of live loops on a piece of waste yarn. They're just upside down. And then at the top edge, we also have a row of loops held on a piece of waste yarn. These are live stitches. So I want to make sure that my waste yarn ends, or the place in the scarf that we stop, is lined up on both ends, or both tube ends of the scarf, I should say. And I'm just going to kind of hold it up and shake it out to make sure that the tube is straight and untwisted and lined up all the way around. It doesn't really matter a whole lot, it just makes it a little bit easier when it's not twisted, then you don't have to try to mess with it the whole time. So here's my untwisted tube, and I'm going to again lay this out so that I have both ends kind of in the middle coming together like so. And so we're going to use this purple yarn to graft it. And if you have watched my grafting video, then this will be easier to understand. This method that I like to use is not as difficult as the Kitchener stitch. So I'm using a series of easy to remember motions, but it does produce the exact same result. So if you wanted to, you could leave the stitches from the top part on the needle and put the stitches from the bottom end on another needle and use the Kitchener stitch. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to do it this way. So we have to do one step before we start. And we're going to look down here since my working yarn is coming off of this piece that's closest to me. So all of these stitches are sitting on a piece of waste yarn in the same direction, but we just want to make sure that they're not twisted. So we want to look at each loop. This is going to be harder to see since it's so small, but we're going to look at the loop that's sitting on the waste yarn, make sure it's not twisted, and that's how we're going to be kind of situating each stitch before we work into it. So I'm going to move the little tails out of the way. So on the piece, or on the end of the piece that is closest to me with the working yarn coming off of it, I am going to insert my needle into that very first stitch coming up towards me, again with the loop not twisted. And as you go around, you want to make sure that you're not splitting or catching the waste yarn because we're going to pull it out. Now, if you do accidentally split it, it's not the end of the world, but it is a little bit harder to get it out because you'll have to go in between the stitches and cut the waste yarn without cutting your knitting. So I've come up through that very first stitch. And now what we're going to do is we're going to come up to the top end, which is the provisional cast on end. And I'm going to look at this end of the waste yarn, and I'm going to try to make sure that the stitches are not twisted. And I am going to come up here and go down through the first stitch on the waste yarn and up through the next one. And like I said, if you want to see this better, go watch the grafting video because it is clearer in thicker yarn with bigger stitches, and the grafting yarn is a contrast color, so it's easier to see. All right, so on this side, we just went down through the first stitch, up through the second stitch. Now we're going to come down to the front end, the closest one to me. And if we look at the stitch that I did the last time, this right here was the loop that I came out of the last time I worked into this end. So I'm going to go down through the loop that I was in the last time and up through the next one, making sure they are not twisted and keeping the waste yarn out of the way. So now I'm going to come back over here to the top end, go to the loop that I worked into the last time I was up here. I'm going to go down through the first stitch, which is the one I just worked into before, and up through the next one. And this is a little bit trickier for me because I am doing this at arm's length instead of at a closer distance to my face where I can see it better. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that through. We don't want it to be too tight, but the idea is to make our stitches match. As far as the grafting stitches, we want to make those stitches the same size as the stitches in the knitting. And that way it will completely blend, because we're essentially creating a row of knitting in between these two stitches, or in between these two rounds of stitches, I should say. So again, I'm going to come back to this side, find the stitch that I worked into the last time I was on this side, go down through that stitch, and up through the next one, and pull it through. Then I'm going to come back up here to this end, go down through the stitch I worked into before, and up through the next one. So I'm going to keep doing this all the way around. Again, if you want more detail, then go ahead and watch the grafting video because it does show this better. But I'm going to come back over here, go down through the stitch I worked into last, and up through the next one. And then I'm going to come back up to this end, go down through the stitch I worked into the last time, and up through the next one. And as long as your stitches are not twisted, this will not show as any wonky part of the fabric. We just want to make sure that our grafting stitches are the same size as the stitches in the knitting, and that will help make it completely invisible. So I'm going to keep doing that all the way around until I get back to the very end. Alright, so I have made it just about all the way back around to where I started, and you can see close to the end here, there's just a little bit of a hole left because I have a couple more stitches left to do. So I'm going to continue grafting these last few stitches, and then I'm going to show you how we close up the hole. And I should mention, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier or not, but the stitches from the provisional cast on are not all sitting on the waste yarn in the same direction. So like down here, where this was my picking up all the stitches onto a piece of waste yarn at the end, all of these stitches sit on the yarn in the same direction. Whereas up here, on the provisional cast on end, they do not all sit facing the same direction. So now that I'm basically to the end of the hole, I have at the top, this is my last two loops that are on the waste yarn. And one of them has the working yarn from the beginning, the purple yarn from the beginning of my cast on, where I started knitting. So now I'm going to come back down here. I still have one loop left on the bottom end, or what was the top when we were knitting it. So I'm going to go down through the one that I worked into last on this side and up through that next one. And so now we have picked up all the loops off of both lengths of waste yarn. So I don't have any more loops on this piece, and I don't have any more loops on this piece because the last one that's on this piece, even though it's not totally finished yet, it is already stitched through on my yarn needle. So I'm going to go ahead and pull out both of these waste yarn strands now. So I'm going to take one end of each of these and pull it out. Now you will notice that my waste yarn from this side is on the front of the work, and the waste yarn on the other side is like hidden, sitting behind the work. That's just because of the way that I picked them up off the waste yarn. On this side, I picked the strands up from like above the waste yarn, and then on this side, I picked them up so that the waste yarn was still holding the tips of the loops. So I picked them up kind of below if we were looking at it this way. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you pick up the stitches because the waste yarn is coming out anyway. So I'm going to grab one end of this, and it's going to kind of cinch all the way around, so you have to just keep pulling on it, and it's going to gather up until it totally comes out. So there's one, and then we'll go ahead and pull out the second one. All right, so if we give that a nice good stretch there, you can see how those two pieces are invisibly joined together. Now, I will not say that my tension was perfect on the graph because it probably wasn't, but it's close enough to matching both sides of the knitting that you can't really see it at all. So now all we have left is this little hole. So on this side, it looks like both of the legs of the stitch above are already gone through by this yarn. And on this side, there's just a loop that has only been gone through once on the other side. So even though there's already a strand of yarn going through that top stitch, the last stitch that I worked into from the top, I'm going to come down through that stitch and up through the next one, which is actually the first stitch we worked into at the beginning. So now my needle is sitting like this, and it looks like I have both legs of that stitch sitting on my needle right now. So now I can go ahead and pull that through. Again, keeping it the same tension. And then I'm going to come back down through the stitch that I was in, that my needle came out of last on this side. And I don't really need to come up through the next one because I already did that. That was my very first stitch of the round right there. So I'm just going to come down, even though it looks like my needle is going this way. I'm going down direction-wise into that last stitch that was sitting on my yarn from the previous time I stitched down here. So now I can go ahead and pull that through. And what I want is to try to make this as invisible as possible. So as I go to finish this off, I want to make sure that all of the stitches around my little opening, or what used to be the opening, are pretty even. Nothing's pulled too tight or too loose. And then I'm going to just slip my needle behind, making sure I do not catch the back of the work as far as the other thickness of my tube. I just want to slide the needle back over underneath the fabric up to where my tail is coming from the other end of the work. And now that both of my tails are in the same place, I'm going to tie them together, and I'm actually going to come down one. I want to make sure that there is a strand of yarn. So you know how there's those little horizontal strands of yarn between your knit stitches? I'm going to make sure there's one of those in between my tail and my finishing tail. And then I'm going to go ahead and tie these together, and then I can bury the tails in between the layers and not really have to worry about them peeking out because they're going to be inside the tube. So now I'm just going to take these two yarn tails, tie them together in a double knot, not super tight because we want the knot to disappear but not be like pulling on the stitches. So we just want it to kind of sit flush with the fabric for now. So there's my double knot. I'm just going to go ahead and stretch that very last grafting stitch just to even it back out, because we did pull on it a little bit when we made the knot. And now we're going to go ahead and bury our tails. So we can see the knot is like right there, but it's going to disappear into the fabric once we bury those tails. So I'm just going to go ahead and take the one yarn tail and bury it in the direction it's going. So we can see this yarn tail is at the top. I'm just going to slip it between the layers and keep wiggling it around to make sure I'm not catching any of the fabric. And then I'm just going to poke the needle out somewhere further down, pull it through, and then I left pretty good length of a tail, so I'm going to trim it because it's kind of long, and then just kind of pull until it disappears into the inside of the tube. And same thing for this tail. I'm going to go ahead and thread this one onto my yarn needle and slip it right down where it's coming from into the fabric. Make sure that I do not catch any of the fabric anywhere inside the tube. And then just poke it out somewhere else, pull it through, and now both of our yarn tails are buried. So you want to give your graft a pretty good stretch in several different directions just to kind of smooth it out if you can. If you find any areas that are visibly off as far as the tension, then you can go through and, like for example, this little stitch right here is a little bit crooked because it is tighter on one side than the other. So any place where you want to just tweak it, then you can go ahead and do that. But blocking will help make this disappear even better because it will help even out the fabric. So once you are happy with the final grafted section, then we're going to go ahead and block our scarf. I am going to do this by wet blocking, mainly because this is a wool yarn and I just have a tendency to prefer wet blocking for natural fibers. And my scarf might look just a tiny bit twisted right now as far as the tube, but it's actually not. It's just that the tube, as it shifts while you're grafting it, can sometimes look twisted, but it's not twisted at all because we grafted the ends together at the beginning and end of the round in both places. And to have that twist, we would have to have a full twist in the scarf somewhere, which would be extremely visible and it would not be able to lay flat like this. So I'm going to wet block my scarf. I'm not really going to like pin it out, but I'm just going to wet it and I'm going to kind of lay it over my blocking mats so that it will just relax in that shape. I don't want to make like any harsh creases on either side because when we wear this, we're going to kind of like poof it up a little bit and make it drape nicely, something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and block my scarf and then it is finished. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you make this project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.